he could do something like that to me, he'll do it to someone else. But yet put up the facade that they care about special education students. Ugh, I was just literally disgusted after that. So when I told them that I was adamant that I was not sending my son back there because he was afraid, and I was afraid because nobody was monitoring him. Nobody was overseeing his care. Basically, I was given my Maryland safeguard parental rights to file for due process. File for due process? Are you serious? That process, number one, would take so long. And secondly, why would I file for due process when I should have been at that meeting to advocate for my son so we wouldn't have to go through this? I wasn't given any options. My son wasn't given any options. I said, he doesn't have a placement. The response was, well, he does have a placement. So basically, no services were going to be provided in Maryland because all services were available at the Bancroft School in New Jersey. Despite my son's fears of returning and my concerns about him returning, my option was to file for due process or send my son back to Bancroft. This decision to send my son back to Bancroft was made based on Bancroft's final investigation report, which during that meeting, I was informed by all three staff, Mr. Barnes, Ms. Gunshore, and Dr. Savage, that none of them had even seen that report. They hadn't even seen it. Now, I sent it in the attachments, but no one bothered to look at it. That's how I know no one looked at it, because I sent it to them. Bancroft was clearly lying. I had clear evidence that there were conflicting reports, and Howard County made a decision to keep my son in harm's way. So Howard County made the decision to violate the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, and not provide my son with FAPE, a free, appropriate public education. Now, according to them, they were providing him FAPE because he could go back to Bancroft. But part of Howard County policy says that students would be in an environment that was conducive for learning. That wasn't conducive for learning for my son. That wasn't even a safe environment for him. He was abused, for goodness sakes. There was an unreported restraint. There is a process for that. And Howard County didn't even bother to follow the process. They didn't bother to investigate, nor did they bother to even request the video to see what actually happened. So they didn't even know what happened. They had no clue. They just blindly made a decision to place my son in harm's way. That was gross negligence. That was mean and just evil. If it were one of their children, they wouldn't dare settle for any such thing. But my son was supposed to just settle or don't get an education. That wasn't fair. That was a violation of American Disabilities Act because technically that's retaliation. And parents and legal guardians have the right to advocate on behalf of a student. And I had that right, but they stripped that right away from me by not allowing me to advocate for him. And all of this occurred after receiving the Maryland State Department of Education final report. So yeah, retaliation was in full effect. And I really couldn't do anything about it except write emails. And I was writing a bunch of emails, copying everybody, getting no responses. I would have to say the one thing that bothered me more than anything about this whole situation was the fact that I had to refer Mr. Barnes back to my email. The email that he said that he had shared with the staff and had discussed and reviewed, all the attachments or whatever. I had to go back and refer him to that email so he could see the evidence that was submitted. And it was unbelievable, the response that I received when I told him to go back and check that email. The only response that Mr. Barnes sent me, after a decision had already been made about my son's placement based on a report that they had never seen, his response was, "My bad." But even after receiving all the information, reviewing all of the documentation, which he said he reviewed, no decision was made to reverse that placement. And my son still was at home alone with no placement. So I was trying to figure out why they would hold his placement until his 21st birthday. But as I journeyed, I realized holding him at Bancroft denied him the ability to receive the many resources and services that were available to him when he was under 21. After 21, you can transfer to adult services. The Bancroft School had sent me an email September 27, 2022, stating that they could not provide the counseling services. So they were recommending an alternative placement, which Howard County was supposed to be working on at that time. Ms. Care supposedly was working on that, but there was always a delay. She was even supposed to be working on getting him housing through Bancroft's admissions department, but never told me that she just stopped looking because they had already made a decision. Now, this meeting was a private meeting between Howard County with Miss Jessica Care and Bancroft. I wasn't invited. I was not invited. The decision was made that an alternative placement needed to be found for him. The crazy part about this is the Maryland State Department of Education had already confirmed that it was a violation that my son did not have a placement, and Howard County needed to find an alternative placement for him. Regardless of them knowing that Bancroft could not provide the counseling services for him, they still placed him at Bancroft, and Maryland State Department of Education didn't do anything except give me my parental rights. It was also noted at this meeting that there was an issue regarding the restraint policy, and Ms. Care had to go back to Howard County to get this addressed by her supervisor. But nobody told me about this, and I didn't know that there was an issue regarding the restraint. So I didn't really know what was going on. I started to include the Maryland State Department of Education on these emails as well. Miss Allison Barmatch. She's the attorney who pretty much comes to these final conclusions. And basically, I got no help. When I told her, hey, Dr. Monterano is not responding, nobody's responding. And she was basically like, well, I can't make them respond. But the MSDE report did say that he had to have a placement by October 8th. That put no pressure on them to expedite anything, but that's what it said. So finally, the IEP was finalized on August the 27th, and referrals could start going out to other schools. But they were sending referrals to residentials. And I said, no, he was not going to another residential. They said because he came from a residential, he had to go to a residential. But the only reason he was at a residential was because the school was out of state, not for any other reason. If the school was in Maryland, he could have came back home and went to school in Maryland because he had been in the hospital for so long and he was pretty much stable at that point. They gave me a hard time with this. So finally, he had a therapist, and his therapist wrote a letter to Howard County stating that it wasn't advisable for him to go to a residential because it would induce more trauma, and the fact that when they had discussions about residential, he got really anxious and he became more behavioral. So this wasn't going to be a good thing for him. So they just ignored whatever she said and pretty much just did what they wanted to do anyway.